Welcome everybody. Welcome everybody to the this Ethnicity Center seminar today. And I'm just getting some details up. Here we are, which is on 15 years after the riots, reflections on Muslims in contemporary France. Those of you who've been coming regularly or noticing the seminars that we've had this term will know that we've been looking at various forms of integration and minorities in different Western European countries. So we've had 3 or 4 seminars, including this one now, on Muslims in France. And today's speaker is Dr. Joseph Downing, who received his PhD from the European Institute at the LSE. His thesis was entitled Between Policy, Recognition and Rioting, analyzing the role of urban governance, historical commemoration, and public culture in defining inclusion in Marseille, Paris, and Lyon. And that was on the basis of an AHRC scholarship that he had to conduct that. Since then, he's been a fellow at the LSE and also a Marie Curie fellow at the Laboratoire Méditerranéen de Sociologie at the University Aix-Marseille and the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. He recently became a senior lecturer in politics and international relations at Aston University. And so now today he's going to talk on the subject that has been his specialist subject from his PhD times. So can I ask everyone to stay muted, and if you like, keep your video off as well. That would be a good idea for the presentation, and then you can come back in. We can all come back in whatever way we want, video or video off, for the discussion later. Thanks for that. So over to you, Joe.
Thank you, Tarek. Thank you for the invitation and the lovely introduction. I've been a long-time fan of the work of the ethnicities group at Bristol, so it's really nice to be here with you guys, if virtually for today. So I'm just going to share my screen. So just give me a moment to set that up. Okay, here we go. Is that clear for everyone? Yep. Okay, good stuff.
Yes,
so
it's Joe. Anyway,
yeah, great. Thank you, Tarek. Yeah, so today I'm going to talk about basically a sort of a broad spread of my work to date, which resulted in a book in 2019 called French Muslims in Perspective, where I tried to sort of, for many different reasons I'm going to discuss in the presentation today, have a broad and wide-ranging intervention into the broader field of the discussion of French Muslims related to these questions of integration, kind of, public construction of French Muslim identities, both, within the French state that we're all quite familiar with probably, but also beyond in society more broadly, and these discussions of integration. And sometimes to try and bring in some paradoxical and little known avenues in this process, right? Because one of the issues with looking at France is that, to a certain extent, it's somewhat a saturated field at times, right? So, there's many different studies on the various forays that the French state has had into regulating different forms of, religious dress, things like that. But there's a lot more going on in France, right? That isn't so easy to access and easy to see, really, from the outside. So I'm going to begin with this question of the broader questions around defining the field, right? Defining the field of, perhaps Muslim studies more generally, which is becoming, it's not really called a field per se, but it's becoming this, and has become this large field of inquiry within the social sciences more broadly. And with some reflections on how this is of particular importance in the French context, and to give you some insight into the normative impetus behind really trying to publish a broad, wider ranging work. And then I'm going to look at this question of visualizing the diversity of French Muslims, looking at this question of the banal, right? So the everyday and the exceptional, to get at some of the key aspects where I see this process of kind of integration, disintegration, and this broader debate taking place around Islam and around Muslims in French society. And then I'm going to add some conclusions in ways I think we would do well to kind of broaden the field in this regard. Okay, so in terms of definitional questions, and France is, I mean, for those of you that know, I'm sorry to repeat anything you know, but France is very interesting from this perspective of definitions, and very interesting in this from this perspective of what can be defined, what can be known, and what can't, right? So key questions within both France and within the broader field are really brought up by this question of definitions, because unlike the UK, unlike the US, France has no official definition nor official statistics on what it is to be a French Muslim, right? It's actually illegal for the French state and for bodies connected to the French state, and thus there's a broader question here in it being in it being taboo really in French society from this perspective of hybridized kind of identities, right? It's illegal for the state to collect statistics on ethnicity and race, which is less known, but perhaps more well known because of recent debates, statistics on religion. So we actually don't know how many Jews, Muslims, Christians, atheists, Buddhists are in France, but nor do we know how many people of South Asian, North African, West African, Caribbean origin are in France, right? So the tools that perhaps, and the tools that are very imperfect, as we know, right, in contexts like the UK and the US, we don't have in studying this question in France at all, right? So the laïcité question in France and in defined by the Republic is that everyone is equal by being red, white, and blue, i.e. French only. There are no Muslims, there are no Christians, there are no blacks, there are no whites. In theory, we know that this isn't the case, and we know that the state in some ways promotes this idea of a kind of negative multiculturalism, I would say, right? So rather than it being this discussion of a multiculturalism that celebrates difference or that discusses different groups, both for the good and the bad, it seems that in French public discourse and in French policy, you can discuss a question of Islam, but only in a negative sense, right? But also little known in this sense, in this context as well, is also the ethnic element is a taboo. But this clashes with this, and the question of religion being a taboo clashes with European norms coming from the EU. This is one of the things that I look at in the book, is this question of, this interesting paradox and interesting clash between European diversity norms that are increasingly important in France in local policy circles, because that's one thing that I think is quite interesting in the French case, is to think about the different layers and the different organs of the French state, right? So the central state, the national context is very fixed, but the local context is very flexible, and it's much more flexible than it may seem at first glance. And one of the reasons for this flexibility in recognizing, using, and it's in a sense valorizing notions of ethnic, racial, and religious difference in France, and thus perhaps following quite a sort of multiculturalist integration agenda, comes from this question of European norms. So if you want money, essentially, to be, part of the Intercultural Cities program from the Council of Europe, if you want money for to be a European capital of culture, it's a box you have to tick, right? It's something that you have to do. You have to be able to demonstrate you have an understanding, appreciation, and a celebration of questions of diversity, right? Usually at the local level, as I said, very much based in the city. Lyon and Marseille are two interesting examples of this in different ways. But this comes into direct clash with the kind of broader national bureaucratic culture, right? And we can see, rather than both of these questions of the illegality of race, religion, and such identity questions at the state level being very fixed. If you look historically into questions of how these became established in the way that they did, even the historical evolution is much more flexible than it may seem on the surface. So the context, while seemingly from the outside is quite fixed, is actually a lot more flexible, right? Which is something that's quite important. So one of the questions here that is important, I'm going to say something a little bit later about the change in the field in France, right? Which is something that we've seen across Europe more generally in terms of who it is that needs to be integrated, right? The key question has become, what do we mean when we talk about Muslims in this sense? Who are we talking about? For what reasons? And with what preconceptions, right? If we were to have a conversation about integration in France, perhaps in the mid-90s, or if you think of 98, when the French national team with Zidane won the World Cup, it was much more framed around a question of racism and racial characteristics in terms of being Arab or being Black, right? Which is not the case today. And this fits into a field more generally, as we've kind of seen in the UK to a certain extent as well. This idea of the dynamic nature of media policy and security conceptions, moving from in the UK to a question of Black and Asian to a question of Muslim, and in France, moving from this question of Arab to Muslim being the key signifier upon which the integration debate has been structured, right? However, neither of these observations, either in terms of statistics or in terms of the shifting nature of policy and of public discourse, get us any closer to understanding who it is that we're discussing, right? And this is one of the questions that really is multifaceted in many ways in the French context, from both a policy context, right, i.e. the practice of these questions, whether we're talking about the national state, the local state, but also in the study of these questions more broadly, right? And I'm going to say a little bit more about that in a moment. So one way that I'm going to problematize this notion of definitions within the field is in the ethnicization of French Muslims and its nuances, right? So one thing that we've got to understand when we ask this question of who are we talking about when we discuss Muslims in France, and this move from perhaps a more racialized discussion to one that's much more about religion, the religious element in France still has elements of race, ethnicity, culture, and class within it. So the way that a Muslim, and especially in a way that being a problematic Muslim in France is constructed, also draws upon questions of class and questions of race. But in terms of thinking about the field and the evolution of the integration debate within the French context, 98, as I said, is a time when we think of Zidane, and a time when we think of this debate, security concerns, racism concerns, integration concerns being structured on this question of ethnicity and of being an Arab, right? And I'll come back to the problematic nature of this term in a second, but it's a bit paradoxical given that most of these individuals may not necessarily identify themselves ethnically as Arabs, but as Berbers, right? But there's this, much broader context at work, right? And we can see moving to kind of 30 years later in 2018, when France won the World Cup again, what can we learn from the figure that was important in that win, who's also a French Muslim, right? In Paul Pogba, right? A Muslim of Guinean origin, right? Well, we can see here, this enables us to see that not just has what it means to be a French Muslim has changed in the discourse, again, whether it's media, security, or public policy, but what it is to be a French Muslim has changed dramatically on the ground. And this is something that's not so obvious to see from the outside either, right? So there's a large increase in West African migration in the past 30 years, meaning that the racial dynamics of the French Muslim population have dramatically changed. So the incoming head of the National Council of Blacks in France, right? The central French state does engage with these councils for minority populations, is a Muslim, a Black French Muslim of Comorian origin, right? So we can see increasingly this question of what it means to be a Muslim in France moves away from a notion of just being one defined by being Arab, i.e. North African, to one that also becomes entangled with a notion of blackness, right? And blackness in a particular way. And it highlights a trend which is not new nor unique to France, is that there are much broader cultural and racial dimensions of French Muslim life and identity that are often under discussed, right? Being the kind of interrelated nature of these kinds of identities. The idea that, you know, it may seem on the surface that when we talk about Muslims in France and the integration debate about Muslims in France, we think of North Africans, right? But the population is becoming increasingly, and although this topic, this concept has been critiqued a lot in the social sciences, I think it does offer us some purchase here. The idea of Muslims in France becoming a super diverse group, okay? Not just because of the colonial links, i.e. Zidane as a North African, clearly a colonial link, Paul Pogba from Guinea, again, French West Africa, a colonial link, but something much bigger is happening, right? In terms of a decoupling, in a sense, of these colonial relationships as the key drivers for migration of French Muslims into France, and it being much more about the broader geostrategic landscape in which France finds itself, right? So you have a photo here on the left, I hope you can see it, that I took in Marseille, where I'm based for part of the year, of a bunch of Afghans in Marseille, right? Of Hazara minority origin from Afghanistan, playing volleyball on the beach, right? Individuals from, you know, a landlocked country playing volleyball on the beach, I thought was a very interesting development. But for our field more broadly, right, the more interesting development is they're Afghan. And this says something about the nature currently, but also specifically as we look to the future of defining the field of what it means to be a Muslim in France, is it's increasingly super diverse. Migration is decoupled for Muslims coming into France and that have come into France in the past 20, 30 years from historical or colonial links. France as a destination or transit country for Muslim populations on the move is constantly evolving and diversifying. Many Afghans I've spoken to in France actually didn't go to France to settle there, right? They were attempted to transit elsewhere in Northern Europe, and in part because of the Dublin regulations, have ended up in France, right? It maybe not, maybe isn't their choice, but it seems that there's this growing long-term, these growing long-term diaspora communities from places like Turkey, Turkish Kurds, Afghans, and recently arrived Syrians due to the civil war, right? So we can see from that perspective of defining who it is we're talking about, we can see a very dynamic picture, and a picture that is constantly evolving and constantly changing, although it may not seem so on the surface. So this is where I come to the kind of normative impetus for this book, and also some of my recent work in the field of thinking about Muslims in France, is you know, the need to do better with the definitions more broadly when we're discussing Muslims in France. So there was a book published in 2014 by Andrew Hussey, which I was extremely disappointed with, to put it politely, that was titled "France is at War with its Arabs," right? And this sought to put current jihadism and radicalization in France in a neat linear relationship from, you know, the independent struggle in the Casbah of Algiers to the massacre of the Bataclan, right? This is all about, you know, one very simple linear relationship. It's about France being just incompatible with a question of what he calls Arabs, right? Again, kind of problematic because they're Berbers, right? But this relationship that is linear, that is neat, that is inherently problematic, and is one that can never be settled, right? France is at war with its Arabs. It has been since the Casbah of Algiers, and thus it will be until the end of time. He doesn't say that, but you get the kind of gist of his kind of key argument, which I found really disappointing and really misleading, right? Because of my experience researching within the field and living in France, seeing the rootedness and centrality of French Muslims in a wide spectrum of everyday life. So here we kind of shift focus a little bit from thinking about questions of integration and state-based policy integration, which is often concerned with the French Muslim problem, to look at perhaps areas where French Muslims are well integrated and rooted in a wide spectrum of everyday life. So I borrow this concept of banal, right? A little bit from Billig and his notion of banal nationalism, in the sense that rooting the understanding of national identity formation in daily acts was what was Billig's key point in banal nationalism, right? And something that the question that I pose here and that I've attempted to look at for a number of different ways in my recent research, including on social media, is thinking about how the banalization of a discussion of Muslims in the European context, but in the French context more specifically, can have some empirical and theoretical advantages over more exceptionalist discussions dominated by terrorism, security, and integration. I think there's an issue here in the production of discourse, and to a certain extent, if we think about people like Hussey, of knowledge in the field a little bit. And I'm not saying we're all guilty of this as scholars, because there is some great scholarship out there, but this is the sort of one that highlights, I think, a worrying trend, is by focusing, rather than focusing on perhaps the banal, rather than we focus on the exceptional, i.e. that exceptional small number of people that commit violent acts. And thus we kind of repeat and we reaffirm a problematic discourse about the integration of Muslims in France. In my opinion, there is not a war between France and its Arabs in the way that Hussey describes, because France doesn't have Arabs that it owns that are Arabs, right? But there is not this inherent incompatibility. You don't see this on the ground. And this can be seen in a sense, right? In this, in unpacking a little bit this dominant conception of conflict, right? This idea of war and terrorism. So as Hussey said, a war between France and its Arabs is this continuity of conflict, as we see on the left, from the Casbah of Algiers to Charlie Hebdo and the Bataclan, right? An idea, not only Hussey's, that has gained a lot of ground amongst scholars, i.e. this inherent incompatibility that unwittingly, or perhaps wittingly, I mean, I don't know the agenda here, right? Mimics far-right voices they would otherwise never echo, right? This idea of focusing on problems and focusing on the extremes, right? But if we look at a question, so if we think about any of you that have ever have wandered into IR here, right? If we think about a kind of securitization of a particular group in France, we can think about this question in terms of urban riots and unrest in French cities, right? We can see in the 70s, 80s, and the 90s, and in 2005, the big one, right? The riots that sent France into the first state of emergency since World War II were mainly discussed in secular terms. So at this particular point, these communities were not securitized per se, i.e. were not constructed as an existential threat to the existence of France because of religion. There was some discourse in a quite marginalized way about these being Muslim riots, right? But generally speaking, and in terms of public policy and in terms of discourse more broadly, these communities were constructed as security threats and an existential threat to France, more in terms of from a class perspective, a territorial and a class perspective, an idea of individuals of, poor socioeconomic standing that lived in squalor on the edges of French cities, right? But we need to think here, I think, about what the local context can tell us more broadly about the French security context, right? So we need to think here about banal insecurity and French Muslims, and how the focus here on the banal insecurity existing in the French context enables us to see more clearly some of the key issues with jihadist-inspired violence in France, and why some acts of terror in France have been so deadly. So you've got this highly organized, lucrative, violent drugs trade with long historical roots and clear links in places like Marseille to local government. But this is not something that's a particularly Muslim or a particularly Arab or a particularly Black issue. It's an issue that cuts across, and there are key actors really drawn from all of the kind of different communities in France that are big in the drugs trade, right? But one thing that we need to consider here is how this drug trade acts as a vector for the transit of heavy weapons that becomes so important in recent years in jihadist inspired violence in France, right? So in France, we've got kind of low tech attacks taking place, people with kitchen knives, Bastille Day attack with using a truck as a weapon. But we also have this question of heavy weapon infiltration into the French context. And the reason they are there is not because jihadists are smuggling them in, and they're not coming from North Africa or from Libya. They're coming over the border from the Balkans to be the key tools of security of organized crime groups, right? So one thing that's an interesting paradox here is the radicalization discourse, the focus of a government such as Macron's on closing NGOs and this kind of outdated conception of mosques as a place of radicalization. Perhaps, you know, prior to 9/11, this was something that was really important, but to me, it doesn't seem to be the place where this occurs, right? This happens with the Charlie Hebdo brothers in a park in Paris. This happens with individuals. We can see like the Bastille Day attacker online. Rather, this is the focus of government policy and public policy discourse, rather than the focus on heavy weapons trafficking, heavy weapons infiltration, and the everyday insecurity and absence of the state in many areas. So I've got two headlines here from different French news outlets, right? One is discussing in a bit more depth the organized crime angle, but the one on the right here is something that I find even more worrying, which is quite common feature of insecurity in the French context, is the use of weapons like Kalashnikovs in relatively low profile crimes, robbing a corner shop, robbing a bar, robbing a betting shop. This is something that's quite widespread and quite worrying, yet isn't part of the French state's discourse around insecurity, which I think it should be, right? So moving on, and again, complicating this notion of the securitization of French Muslims in a bit more depth, and something that I've done work on, right, in how biographies and the commemoration of victimhood in recent French terror attacks can tell us some quite interesting stuff about French Muslims, right? We can see this question of service and victimhood being really important in a rare, actually, quite a rare window into the integration or the, you know, the strong integration of French Muslims in a wide range of fields in French society, right? So we can see Olivier Roy in 2017 produced a blog post. Olivier Roy being, you know, a French scholar that produces some quite good work, I think, in the field, that argued that roughly 10 times more French Muslims served in French security forces than joined ISIS. One of the interesting features, if any of you have been to France in recent years, of the Operation Sentinel anti-terror patrols on the streets of French cities has been their very multi-ethnic makeup, right? Many of the individuals that are charged with, you know, carrying out anti-terror patrols on the streets of French cities, who serve in the French army to protect the Republic, are of Black, Muslim, and North African Muslim origin. And we can see a picture here on the left that shows this in terms of their contributions to the contemporary French police force, where they're quite, again, statistics are an issue in France. We don't have reliable statistics, unfortunately, but where there are a large number of French Muslims working in local police forces, we see Ahmed Merabat, somebody that was killed in the Charlie Hebdo attacks, who was French of Moroccan Muslim origin. We can see here two pictures on the right that come from Le Monde newspaper's online commemoration of victims of the Bastille Day attack. We can see that actually French Muslims are not just individuals that serve in the security forces, but are also individuals that are victims in French terror attacks, right? And something that I did a study on was looking at these public commemorations and ways in which we can see them perhaps nuancing the meaning of jihadism and terrorism within the French context. So, gender and French Muslims. So this is something that's quite interesting to consider, right? So what can this sort of enable us to see within the field more broadly. So I've got two images here that you might find quite familiar, or that may raise fairly familiar debates within the French context. One being the full face veil ban. There's a very interesting anecdote of journalists in Paris going to look in the run up to the ban for women that wear the full face veil and not being able to find any, right? Because it was a ban on a piece of clothing that was really not at all widespread in the French context, right? And a ban that came from the national the central state. However, when we look at the burkini ban on French beaches in the south of France a couple of years ago, this is something that actually comes from the local state, right? It was a municipality in the south of France that initiated the first ban, which was then copied by local municipalities and was then overturned by the central French state as being unconstitutional, right? So again, you can see here something that's really important about thinking about integration in the French context is the flexibility of the integration question, but also the need to consider not a single French state, but several French states, right? Because the state is this diverse makeup of different organs, which I think is sometimes somewhat overlooked, right? Because the French, in the French context, France is quite centralized, but also the very vocal nature of the central French state becomes important. But what can we also see here? From other ways of thinking about this question of French Muslims more broadly, and perhaps interesting inroads for future discussions and future scholarship and future studies, is this question of gender in French Muslims, and how this is something that exists in a banal sense, but also that's constructed in French popular culture as being something that's quite important. So we've got here Samia Ghali, French socialist senator for the Beauce-du-Rhône and mayor of the 15th and 16th arrondissements of Marseille, right? So somebody who is a French Muslim of Algerian extraction who is very high up in the French state, right? And actually works in the Republic in a quite prominent sense. But we also see something here that's becoming increasingly important. And this is something that, you know, when I wrote this up in my book, gave me many sleepless nights because it's a little bit of a contentious topic and something that in the social sciences we're still yet to, I think, fully tackle, right? Which is the way that pornography in the sexualization of society has become a feature of popular culture, right? Whether we kind of like it or not, right? It's something that has become extremely accessible and extremely popular. And, you know, in the French context, individuals have made a career in this field and then transitioned into mainstream television and media as they've done in other places. But one thing I think that's important to consider here is how this kind of erotic content has increasingly focused on portraying kind of Orientalist tropes, contemporary Orientalist tropes about French Muslims within the French context, right? So I'll give you some examples here. So for me, this is a very interesting way. So if we consider the kind of Orientalist French paintings, not French, the Orientalist paintings of the 19th century that enabled us to gaze into the hammam, for example, right? To gaze at the Oriental woman in the hammam. This is what this kind of erotic content in contemporary France enables individuals to do. It enables individuals to gaze on the French Muslim woman, not in the hammam, because that's not her context in the ideas of the kind of, you know, French society, but in the housing estate, right, for example. And in some ways to construct French Muslim men as these kind of, you know, misogynistic, manipulative figures, and French Muslim women as this kind of erotic and exotic feature of the French landscape, right? So this question of perhaps looking at an idea of digital Orientalisms and new forms of digital Orientalisms where these notions of Muslimhood are paradoxically, because you wouldn't expect to find it there, right? You wouldn't expect to look at, you know, pornography to look at a religious identity, for example, right? But it's something that's becoming increasingly prevalent and increasingly important. Also, in terms of gender, any of you that are fans of detective shows, there's a French detective show, Les Engrenages, which is set in Paris. In English, it's called Spiral, and it's featured on BBC4. And in one series, they have an entire storyline on a North African family, a North African organized crime family. And this is something that I also cover and try and deconstruct a little bit in my book, is this emergence in the French cultural field of the Muslim gangster, right? So if we think about the trope and the construction perhaps of the black gangster in the US, we can see this emergence of this paradoxically at one time highly violent kind of organized crime figure, but also highly pious and very Muslim, right? There's very many interesting paradoxes of this in this detective series, and again show another way in which this debate and the remaking of these identities takes place, not just in the French state at its various levels, but also in popular culture more broadly. And in the sense of this detective show, moves us away from thinking about gender just in terms of femininities, but also enables us to look at it in terms of masculinities as well, right? And how, you know, masculinities become attached to this notion of being a criminal, right? And this interesting tie-up of masculinities, class, race, and religious identities at the same time, right? So for some concluding remarks here, the need to think carefully about how we frame this discussion of the integration debate in the French context, right? As I've said, the state, it seems to be dominated by the very centralized central state, but things in France are much more flexible, right? It's much more about the interplay of the national, the local, in terms of cities, in terms of municipalities, in terms of different local actors and personalized relationships, but also the international, in terms of the intrusion of European forms of governance into the French context. And this clash, really, of bureaucratic cultures between France, which is very colorblind and assimilationist, and European forms of governance that demand France to become more open to the valorization and the celebration of diversity, right? The inability of media and sometimes scholars in the French context to account for the banal as well as the highly exceptional. So something that I've tried to sort of do here is to open up a number of discussions of ways in which the integration of French Muslims can also be seen in their more banal contribution to French society, as well as extreme examples like jihadism or riots, right? The change in nature of Muslims themselves on the ground, right? The super diversity of the French Muslim population that is often obscured by the lack of statistics, but also by kind of historical stereotypes. So you've got a situation of increasingly large numbers of French Muslims of African, Black origin, white French Muslim converts, Afghans, as my picture of the Marseille beach demonstrated, as well as the more established North African communities, right? The French Muslim identity takes on an ever more diverse socio-cultural, racial dynamic. And the question here really of the kind of political economy of both the news media, does it incentivize the focusing on extremes, and what role does this play in mirroring the rhetoric and kind of reinforcing the rhetoric, perhaps unwittingly, right, of the far right in the French context? So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Joe. I think that set us up nicely to talk to you more, to ask you more about some of the developments in France. So what I suggest at the moment is anyone who would like to now unvideo themselves. No, that's not what I mean. I mean the opposite. If anyone would like to put their video on, please do so. But if you could keep yourself muted so that we don't have any interference, noisy interference, till you actually want to ask a question, then of course, when you're invited to ask a question, of course, do then unmute yourself. So, of course, if you don't want to use the video, that's fine as well. Anyway, while people are kind of mulling over what you said, maybe I could kick off, Joe, by kind of asking you a little bit more about the big picture that you want to engage with. So as I see it, the big picture that you've constructed for us is the top-down power of securitization and securitization discourses that tries to construct certain images of Muslims. And you either want to counterpose or to balance that by a focus on the everyday, the banalization, the multi-ethnicization or super diversity, as you say, of the Muslim population. And that could either just be an alternative focus of study, or it may tell us something about the securitization problematic. So I wasn't sure which you wanted to say, that, oh, we're too obsessed by one thing, let us look at another, or that if we look at the everyday, we will have newer, more interesting things to say that will speak to, critically speak to, the securitization problematic. So that's one kind of general big picture question I wanted to put to you. And a related one, also kind of big picture one, is, so your title, perhaps it was a little bit of a hook, a little bit of a tease, but your title asked us to think about the riots of a certain years ago. And so that was then, and where are we now? But in your presentation, you didn't follow that logic to say, well, there were these riots and this is how it's kind of panned out, and why we haven't had more, or we have had more, but they haven't been reported in the same way or anything. And finally, how does that relate to the very large dominant themes of laïcité, which are driving not just kind of policy and law, with the laws on separatism and demanding declarations, signed declarations by Muslim organizations and so on, but the general public opinion understanding of Muslims. So it seems to me that laïcité surely must be part of the big picture, not just securitization.
No, really interesting question. Definitely really interesting questions. And I think the idea was of mine, and is to kind of look at a little bit of both. So this idea of a kind of alternative focus, or alternative focuses, right, being important ways that scholarship can be produced on the subject, that doesn't just constantly focus in on the kind of same topics of the central state and what the central state does, right? Because the central state is only one, actually, in terms of, and this is where I think flipping between thinking of it in terms of a kind of political science versus kind of sociology, cross-disciplinary discussion is really interesting, because the French central state is only one very small part of the much larger kind of societal, social picture that exists out there. So I think these alternative focuses can give us other avenues to consider the ways in which French Muslim identities are discussed and constantly evolving, right? One thing that's really important here is their constantly dynamic nature. And for me, the kind of problem with a book like Hussey's, which takes this idea of a never-ending war between France and its Arabs, is that the war that I see going on between France and its Arabs in France, I don't like to use that phrase, right? But I'm just trying to use a shorthand to relate to the question of his book, is not coming from the Muslim side often.
No.
Is rather coming from the central state, right? For many different reasons. And this is where I think looking elsewhere other than the state enables us to see this much bigger picture. Things like the role of, French Muslims in service and as victims in terror attacks enables us to see, hold on a second, there's a much bigger picture. There's a much kind of more paradoxical situation taking place. And for me, relating this back to separatism, the state, and this larger question that you raised about riots, is the rioting aspect for me is an interesting counterpoint, because it enables us to look at a point in time when the dominant notions of the securitization of French Muslims, both in popular discourse, but also in the voices coming from the state, was very much one that lacked a notion of religion, right? It really was about class, and it really was about territory. And something about France that's quite interesting is the way that policymakers and scholars, because they don't have a vocabulary of ethnic minorities and discrimination and stuff like that, have attempted to solve this issue is actually through territory, right? By looking at a kind of almost like a territorial multiculturalism. So we know that these people live here somewhere, so we'll concentrate on that somewhere rather than the people, which I think has had quite limited often results. But the hook of the riots really enables us to see how the context of securitization because there's a kind of sort of dialectic sort of at work here between the French state and French society, right, where they kind of begin to reflect and to co-construct each other. This securitization moves on from being one that's about race, class, and territory to one that's about religion first and foremost, but that takes on still elements of that pre-existing notion of class, of territory, of race, and of those racial hierarchies, in a sense, of the French Empire, right? Really, that's kind of where they originate from. The separatism bill here, for me, I think is really interesting because, for me, it represents a kind of a sort of quite a significant escalation in this rhetoric and the practice of the securitization of Muslims and Muslim organizations in France, and one that, for me, kind of really does miss the mark, right? There doesn't seem to me to be, from my perspective, having looked at and done research on jihadist biographies in France and where these individuals not only come from, but how they go into and how they get into this question of, joining ISIS in Syria or planning attacks in France. They don't go through NGOs, right? They don't go through religious organizations. This is something that was important, perhaps, pre 9/11, before mosques and such organizations across the Western world became very highly surveyed and regulated and examined. It seems to me that the separatism bill totally misses the mark in focusing on definable organizations when the radicalization that does occur and is quite small in number, right, in comparison to the larger French Muslim population, occurs online, or occurs a mix of online and close interpersonal relationships through things such as Telegram or social media apps. That this doesn't seem to register on the radar of the French state for some reason. Maybe it's a generational, maybe it's somewhat of a generational issue, right? Like, I don't know if they consider Telegram as being vital in this process, which it is, right?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, at the time of those riots, there was a very noticeable discourse in France, more in France than in Britain, actually, that wanted to dismiss the idea that the riots had anything to do with Muslims. They said, look, here are people who feel oppressed, they don't have jobs, they are stigmatized, and one of the triggers of the riots was President Sarkozy calling them scum and so on. People whose daily lives involve a lot of strife and tension, especially with the police, and there was a spark, and young people responded to that in certain kinds of neighborhoods or localities or what you call territory. So there was that discourse, and in fact, it was actually quite strong at the time.
Yeah.
And other people who wanted to talk about Muslim identity found it quite difficult at that point to relate it to those disturbances. And insofar as they were able to relate it, it was more in the suggestion that actually some local Muslim groups are working to dampen down the potential for violence by creating youth organizations, sometimes to do with sport and so on, and of course, sometimes to do with the education of Islam, education of faith. But that seems to have become a very weak discourse in France in quite a short period of time. And of course, we have this very strong right-wing discourse that you've been talking about securitization and Muslims somehow being a problem for the Republic because they're refusing to recognize the normative imperatives of the Republic. And that right-wing discourse is now well into the center, especially as President Macron has embraced it fully. But what they don't seem to have, or tell me if they do have it, and I'd like to know more about it, even if it's minor compared to the other two, is what we might call a center-left response to the culturalist tropes about Muslims without simply replacing discussion about Muslims by discussion about socioeconomic categories. So in Britain, we have some kind of a multiculturalist discourse. We certainly, especially in the last few years, have a very strong anti-racist discourse, which connects with issues of class, but is not reducible to socioeconomic categories. Are there some discourses like that? And if not, why not?
Yeah, no, very, very, very interesting. And this is one of the sort of sad current states of affairs of the French political context as we go into the next election, is the absence of this and the way that this discourse has died off in the left in France over the past kind of 20 years, right? So Hidalgo, who is trying to run for the socialist candidate for the presidential election, who is the mayor of Paris, very much champions her own Spanish heritage and the fact that she's somebody of French nationality and a sort of identity, but has come from elsewhere, but yet doesn't really have a discussion around any of these questions, right? And that's something that was even absent in the previous, as you've highlighted, presidential election, was a lack of a discussion even of these problems in a socioeconomic sense, right? So because of the taboo of these identity categories in France, which is interesting because they're supposed to be a taboo in certain functions of the state, but that taboo is not supposed to extend, as it is in the law, right, into a much larger discussion in society itself. And indeed, as I said, in a kind of negative multiculturalist sense, they're not a taboo when you want to kind of highlight a problem, right? And this is something that, that's been absent from the political field for some kind of 10 years at least. It's interesting. I think there are some issues with the changing nature of the left in France that we can see kind of some parallels and perhaps some differences with the change of the left in the UK. So the left in France, the Socialist Party at least, used to be very much about the factory workers, many of whom were located in the north of Paris, who came from post-colonial migration flows and stuff like that. But increasingly it's become almost gentrified and become concerned with courting voters who are wealthy, who are perhaps upper middle class, who live in cities, who have one of Hidalgo's big campaigning slogans has been about a green agenda, right? And pushing sustainable development in France at the and not discussing any of these issues, right? That's kind of her key pitch. And we can see this as being a serious issue, and how really something quite profound has happened in France, where the Socialist Party is effectively dead, right? At the national level, in terms of its ability to win elections, since Hollande has just been completely absent. They even mooted at one point not fielding a candidate for the next French president election, which is insane, because I mean, this is one of the key sort of pillars of the French political landscape, and that's one of the key issues, right? Mélenchon has polled okay with a very hard left kind of agenda, but even he isn't really discussing these kinds of issues, right? He's a very much a sort of old school economic nationalist kind of French lefty in a sense, right? And yeah, this is just completely absent from the political field, I think, unfortunately, even in the limited socioeconomic inequality territorial sense.
Yeah, yeah. Now, this isn't meant to be a private conversation between Joe and I. So if anyone would like to come in, please use the function to raise a hand, or just make yourself available on video and put your hand up. So I very much welcome other people joining the discussion with comments, questions, any comparative remarks between France and elsewhere, including of course Britain, or remarks about the developments that are taking place, which in many ways are kind of anticipating the presidential contest, people positioning themselves, especially Macron, for that, and interestingly positioning himself well to the right of where he was last time in the last contest, when he was supposed to be the new center. So I don't see any. Pierre, great. Please go ahead and put your question or comment, Pierre.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Joseph, for a really interesting presentation, and Derek for hosting it. I was just wondering, following what you've just said on the absence of a multiculturalist discourse in the political sphere, I was wondering, does this also extend to civil society? You mentioned, Joseph, the National Council of Blacks, I think at some point. I think Muslims also have their own representative organizations in civil society. So how are they reacting to the political context, to this very stigmatizing and securitizing right-wing discourse on cultural minorities? Are they trying to put forward a more diverse view of the French nation, or do they have kind of a strategy to face this situation, or are they just completely overwhelmed by the opposition? Yes, that was my question. Thank you.
A very interesting question. Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, I'm not entirely sure, because it's not something that I'm currently doing research on, but my impression is that they've come out to condemn recent, like the separatism bill and the crackdown on NGOs, but they themselves tread a very fine line. One of the things that I found when I was interviewing, so to kind of bookend this talk and to bookend my research, where's the camera there, more generally. So I started by looking at this question of the local French state, NGOs, and an emergent kind of multiculturalism from the ground up, in a sense. And in recent years, I've looked at sort of terrorism, security, and some social media stuff. And I'm currently now going back in the light of the separatism bill to look at this question of NGOs, and how, as Tarek mentioned, something that's really important in the French context is the power that NGOs have had as an integrating force, and the power that NGOs have had as one of the few arenas in a sort of quasi-state sense where hybridized identities, as we'd see them from an English-speaking context, or discussions of perhaps a multiculturalist policy agenda have taken place historically, right? Because they've got this, law where they're sort of like related to the state, but they're not part of the state. So they've got much more flexibility. And I see, as these organizations are clamped down on, a bit like within the broader kind of political sphere, everyone's treading a very fine line. No one wants to be the subject of a polemic. And one thing that came up in research that I did on local level NGOs was the fear that activists had often in being swept up in a national polemic. So there's one organization that I did some work on in the Paris suburb of Nanterre, where, you know, the activist in charge of the organization did something like try to get a school named after a French Algerian intellectual. So like not a contentious figure, right? Like not somebody that's, you know, was a freedom fighter or took up arms or, you know, something like that, right? It was very like uncontentious. And he found himself on the front page of national newspapers, accused of all kinds of things. And it was, for him, it was really troubling for his personal life because, you know, he wasn't an actor on the national kind of political stage. And why that's important, because that's how I see these larger organizations often behaving extremely cautiously, because they're treading this very thin line of they owe their existence in many ways and their sustenance to the French state, right? I don't know how much the French Council of the Muslim Faith has widespread legitimacy or widespread support on the ground, because it's seen as something that's very much orchestrated by the center, right? So they kind of, I think, often tread this very fine line of maybe offering the occasional condemnation, but not really wanting to enter the fray, right? Just wanting to kind of remain a little bit out of the national context as it becomes ever more hostile to them, really, if that makes sense, right? I think we can't overestimate what a daring move in contemporary French politics it would be for you as an activist, an NGO, a national council of faith, or a politician to come out and articulate an alternative agenda, right? I mean, this was something that was quite taboo prior to the Bataclan, prior to Charlie Hebdo, but now it's something that is just, you know, it would be such an unthinkably taboo thing to do, unfortunately, that nobody, I think, is willing to go down that road. There are interesting groups like the Indigenous of the Republic, who articulate an alternative vision, but very much based on Fanon, a certain amount of Maoism, and a quite kind of extreme post-stroke decolonial view of France and French society. But I don't think that these are individuals really who have much purchase in the political sphere, nor the intellectual sphere, nor on the ground, actually, right? Their ideas are seen, I think, as a little bit kind of, you know, a little bit far out quite often, right? So they seem to be the only kind of actors on in the French field that seem to try and articulate some kind of alternative.
I think what you said about the fear that some civil society actors and organizations have of being polemicized, sensationalized, of becoming the target of quite large-scale national attacks and stigmatizations across the media, intellectuals, politicians, all joining in and so on. I think that's very compelling account. And we know that there has been, over the years, been at least one figure who has actually tried to be a public figure in a controversial, but not, I think, unconstructive way, but who in the last few years has been actually the victim of very serious, well, critiques is putting it mildly, but because it's now very much involved in the judicial process. So I'm talking about Tariq Ramadan, because here was someone who was on television debating issues with the president, who was writing op-eds, who was a very articulate public intellectual with high profile in the media, and at least at some times with some NGO following. I don't know how that went, but at one point, I mean, that's how he was noticed because he began to get quite large attendances at meetings in the late 1990s and early 2000s. But then he's been now snared in this very long and unproductive judicial prosecution. So I wonder if, I mean, I've been following that, but I don't read French, so I don't know exactly how he's understood or his case is interpreted in the French media, and in particular in the French intellectual media. So I'd quite like to hear anything you have to say on that, and whether he is, as it were, an example of a punished Muslim intellectual that then has a chilling effect on others.
No, it's a really good point. I was in France over the summer, and I watched I mean, one interesting thing about France and French TV are these long kind of intellectual debates that they still have on TV that we don't really have in the UK, right? And I was watching one between Bernard Henri Lévy and Eric Zemmour, right? And they would, yeah, you can imagine, right? It was interesting to say the least. But they were very much debating these kinds of issues. But I did wonder. I was kind of like, okay, is this all that the French intellectual scene can produce? Like an individual who's kind of like far right, who's Jewish, that kind of denies the role of Vichy in deporting Jews. It's kind of like Zemmour is quite an interesting and kind of bizarre intellectual figure, and Lévy, who is this almost, you know, like a caricature of the Parisian champagne socialist, right, with the floppy hair and everything. And the kind of person missing from that kind of debate was someone of Tariq Ramadan, is kind of stature that he had prior to this judicial process over sort of several infidelities and stuff. And I think, but the thing with Tariq Ramadan, which was really interesting, was he was someone who was very much subjected to a constant barrage of criticism and, in a sense, actually securitization, right, which seems to be my favorite word of the moment. You know, there was an argument made years ago that he spoke French in the intellectual circles and he spoke Arabic in the suburbs, i.e. trying to say that he said two very different things to different audiences. And at one hand, he was a kind of rabble-rousing, you know, recruiter for extremist Islamic ideologies on one hand, and then would speak very good French in intellectual circles and say everything was okay, which was totally unfounded, right? And I think even before his tangle in the judicial realm, which I think has kind of really destroyed his career in many ways, right? And has rendered him kind of irrelevant in the French context. He was someone that was constantly attacked. And that's the thing I think that his example, even prior to that, shows, is just the contentious nature of even trying to engage in these kinds of debates and putting forward an alternative, right?
Yeah. So we have a question in the chat, Joe, from Jaren Sangul. He's having an internet connection issue, so he's typed up his question. To help you, I'll read it out for you and others. So he asks, do you think the switch to more right-wing policies of Macron will create a backlash amongst the Muslim population for presidential elections? If so, what would be the alternative for those people?
You know, it's really interesting, right? Because Macron is so unpopular, right? I mean, he's still leading the polls in France, but I think, you know, there was a kind of a joke made recently that, you know, nobody thought that a French president could be less popular than Hollande, but along comes Macron and he's even more unpopular. And I think that's the problem. There's two problems here that I see in his move to the right in the coming presidential campaign. One being, I don't think people really take much of what he says very seriously, right? And I don't think in France there's necessarily, I think, and again, this is a massive homogenization of a very diverse place, right? But I don't think the public more generally hold views as extreme as the politicians often push, right? If I'm honest, right, in my experience. But again, that's a particular and quite limited experience as someone from England, right? So it's not, you know, it's not like a result of a large scale kind of quantitative analysis, right? But I do think there isn't that appetite necessarily for this backlash, nor do people necessarily take what he says as particularly convincing, right, on any issue, let alone this particular issue. But the problem it does create is, and even several French Muslim friends of mine joked with me about this over the summer, that well, we may as well vote for Le Pen, because I mean, even she's not as bad as Macron is currently, and even she's not as extreme as Macron is, and at least Le Pen's honest, and we know that she hates us, whereas Macron dances this kind of bizarre line saying, no, everything's fine, but I'm going to clamp down on this, right? And I think that's a real issue, and I think I personally, my prediction for the election is someone on the center right. So I think Bertrand, maybe, if there's no skeletons in his closet, there's no Me Too moment, there's no financial scandal like there was for Fillon, I think Bertrand can quite easily possibly take the next election. But there's a problem here, as Alec Hargreaves once said to me, who's a very interesting scholar that produced very good work on multi-ethnic France, that was a massive inspiration to me, that the problem with France is the tail wags the dog, and that the problem with this constant sort of ramping up, and he said this to me like would have been probably 10 years ago, right? So I mean, this is before even things got to this particular point, that the problem with ramping up this rhetoric is you kind of make it the key point upon which politics is contested. And that is where I see the emergence of Zemmour being able to come into the picture with, you know, someone who says very bizarre things about French history and about, you know, the Vichy regime, you know, wasn't really deporting Jews, it was trying to protect them, and all these kinds of bizarre things that would, you know, in many other states render a person politically dead, really, right? What makes him popular and what enables him to enter the field is the fact that these discourses have kind of become mainstream, which I think is really quite worrying, right? There isn't somebody with the kind of clout and the courage to try and differentiate politics in a different direction, which many, I mean, I was quite intrigued to see that Macron's campaign the first time round totally neglected many of these issues. He wasn't someone that spoke about even the suburbs or unemployment. He was very much about reform and a free marketization of France, right? Which is kind of, to a certain extent, like many, like Sarkozy failed at, and is now kind of almost remade himself in the mold of this kind of populist leader. But many thought that Macron would perhaps be a bit more progressive on some of these issues than he has been, but he hasn't. He's chosen to go in a very different direction.
Yeah. So I'll say again, please feel free to come in into the discussion with questions and comments by using the chat function. You can, you can use the chat function, or I was going to say raising the hand function, or just putting your video on and raising your hand. Yes, and someone wants to. Jonathan James, yeah, go ahead, Jonathan.
Hi, yes, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation and lots to think about in terms, I've written loads of notes, but just in terms of the interaction of the local, the national, the European, and the changing nature of Muslims in France, and kind of the intersection between class, ethnicity, and religion. And my question was kind of about the latter, really. So often in the literature, we get a timeline that starts of kind of the religification of Muslims in France, that starts in 1989 with the kind of first veil incident, and you would draw a line up until now. But what's interesting about what you said, and giving you a lot to think about, is that the riots perhaps don't really fit into that timeline. So I wondered if you could speak more to that, or whether you do see this process of religification as going back to these early veil incidents. Maybe you don't, or if you do, like how did the the riots in 2005 escaped that framing?
Oh, that's actually a really, really good question. Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, it's an interesting one because it was something that was they both kind of coexist, right? This as they have done in kind of many different contexts across the world in different ways. This idea of kind of the mix of these intersecting identities of marginalization sort of change over time. So for me, there wasn't, that the first kind of veil law is a kind of watershed moment where a notion of religion really enters the picture as something that's seen as problematic, which wasn't necessarily seen as an issue before, right? Which in a sense drew a lot on kind of more of international developments, perhaps even more so than domestic kind of French developments. And the interesting thing about the riots is one way of kind of looking at that in the inverse is to look at the way that French society mobilized prior to that moment, which is very much along, SOS Racisme, organizations against, there's an ex-colleague of mine from Aix-Marseille who did a very interesting thesis recently on police brutality in Marseille, just in the immediate period after the independence of Algeria. So many of the Pied Noir policemen in Algeria came back to France on independence and were given jobs in the French police forces across the country, but mainly in Marseille, because that's where most of them ended up. It's Mediterranean, it's the port, it's where they came, and thus began to kind of carry out sort of random incidents of brutality on Arab youths because they were Arabs and because they had this issue with independence and the War of Independence, etc. So the mobilization against that and the mobilization against marginalization in France also took this kind of racial class kind of element, somewhat inspired by, as it has been globally, by events, I think, in the US, right? And one of the interesting things about France as a country is it's often discussed as something that's very much disconnected from the US or very much sits in opposition to US ideas and US ideals. But this is something on the ground, especially in young and kind of multicultural communities, isn't necessarily such a given, right? Rather, many individuals conscious of the problems of the US see the US as kind of in some ways more radically egalitarian than France, right? A way that, the emergence of a Black middle class for them is evidence of something that's possible in a sort of much more free market system that's not as much, in their opinion, as they've expressed it to me. I'm not saying this is the case, right? Less nepotistic, less state controlled, less about who you know, more about kind of being able to produce something, right? And yeah, I think that's in addition to thinking about the riots, I think also one of the reasons they're framed in the way they are is because of the way that mobilization had taken place up until that point in society, and thus there was that kind of intermix of the way that it was seen was also seen that way because of the dominant mobilization against marginalization that was familiar to people at that time was one about class and race, really, right? And it's interesting to see also in the scholarship. So Gilles Kepel, that did some work on Islam in the UK and Islam in France, then went off to do a lot of stuff, call it quasi-diplomatically, right, in the Middle East and on the Arab Spring, conveniently, to a certain extent, turned his focus back to France and produced this massive study about the French suburbs after the riots. And his argument, which I don't think is necessarily accurate, right? And I think is quite problematic, was the discussion of the Islamization of the French suburbs, right? So after the riots, promises were made, we're going to remake the suburbs, we're going to give, we're going to try and tackle some of these socioeconomic issues. And in his analysis, this didn't work, this didn't happen. And what happened instead was an Islamization of business, of society, of activism in the French suburbs, right? Which I don't know I don't think is necessarily accurate or necessarily the full story, but was very much, I think, in terms of a intellectual endeavor, shaped by the way that the political debate had moved in France, right? So I think there's this interesting interplay between, you know, all of these different factors, like the riots themselves and what brought them about, how they were framed because of the way that fights against marginalization had been framed in the French context, and how, you know, the growing sort of fever pitch of debates about religion and religion being an issue in France perhaps then go into shaping how, you know, scholars and intellectuals look at this particular issue as well. If any of that made sense, hopefully.
I mean, a lot of our conversation or discussion with you, Joe, has focused on the state and macro discourses that the state participates in, leads in, and, you know, presidential candidates and so on. And of course, you want to say, well, look, shouldn't we be thinking about the everyday lives of Muslim people in France? So let me ask you a question that addresses that other side, though addresses it in a broad sociological way rather than what we might call micro studies way. Now, as we know, and as you made plain, France does not collect data in the way that we do and the US do, and, you know, a number of other places do, by ethnicity or race or religion for that matter. But just relying on impression and social commentary, it's been quite common over a period of time for people to say that one of the differences between Muslims in France and Muslims in Britain lies around the issue of religiosity and religious community formation. So it has been said that relative to, say, groups like Pakistanis and Bangladeshis in Britain, that Muslims in France are not so religiously observant and are not so, they're not looking for religious education for their children in the way that some South Asian parents might be in Britain. And that the likelihood of a Muslim marrying a non-Muslim is higher in France than it is in Britain. And these are all based on impressions because there's no data. I mean, there is data on the British side, but there's no comparative data on the French side. But here is something that is moving closer to your focus on the everyday, because it's about people's lives and relationships and their community embeddedness or lack of embeddedness. I wonder if you want to pick up on that theme as we move towards a close.
Definitely. No. A really, really fascinating question. Something, I mean, and this is one of the interesting sort of dimensions of France when you look at, you know, I've seen some socioeconomic data that looks at the participation of those with foreign. So one of the proxies that they use in France to get statistics on this issue is to look at people who have foreign-born parents or those that are foreign-born, right? I mean, this is again like super problematic, but it's kind of the best they've got, right? Really. And there's a question of France. There's an idea that in France, individuals with foreign-born parents are much more likely to participate in the labor market than in some other Western European context, perhaps like Holland. I think the juxtaposition that this, I can't remember the author's name, but the economist was saying was that, for, you know, Holland, with all of its multicultural credentials, doesn't seem to get people into the labor market in the way that France, with its sort of more assimilationist perspective, has done. And it's a very interesting point that he's making, right? I mean, it's something that is quite intriguing here. I think one of the kind of issues in France that has become and feeds back into this kind of macro discourse type perspective is the supply side of religious institutions in France, right? And again, like, I don't want to make overly problematic assumptions because I'm not so familiar with how this has affected, or if we can even say it has had an effect in the UK, right? But in France, it's so much more difficult to create a mosque, for example. So you can create like a community association relatively easily, right? But to build some kind of institution, and some kind of institution that has meaning in that religious sense, is really, really difficult, right? Even in a sense of trying to get planning permission for a building that serves a religious function or would serve as a mosque is extremely difficult. Marseille, for example, right, has roughly around, again, we don't have figures, but is estimated to possibly even be a Muslim majority city in Europe, but definitely has maybe 30-40% of the population is, you know, in this broader sense, perhaps not practicing, but of Muslim origin, right? But doesn't have a central mosque, and which is a real paradox. So you've got a population of at least 200,000-300,000 possibly Muslims in Marseille, and there's no central mosque, there's no central place of worship, there's no central institution, and that's one of the issues in France. Perhaps the demand isn't there because the supply is not there, and the supply is not possible, and because there's a lack of these institutions, individuals don't have that frame of reference that is a place that you can go. And this, interestingly and paradoxically, has been something that's been picked up on repeatedly by politicians. Macron in the separatism bill, Le Pen a few years ago, and also there were some discussions about banning praying in the streets in France, because what does happen then is that individuals on a very micro scale create a mosque or a prayer space, more accurately to say, in a shop, in a basement, in a garage, in any kind of small space that they can put the money together to get hold of. And then this itself is problematized in a public sense, that, oh, this is, you know, these small local organizations are places of radicalism. They're away from the gaze of the state. They're not, you know, controlled or properly registered or whatever, but they are a function of this absolute lack of being able to create these kinds of institutions that we see dotted across the UK in a French context, really.
Yeah. I think there's some truth in that. It'd be good to have better data, of course.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Joe, for sharing your research with us and making us think about French society and the place of Muslims within it, especially as I say, this term we've been thinking comparatively, looking at a number of different Western European countries. We actually are coming to the end of that particular series of seminars, and our next seminar will be a more general conceptual one on fear of strangers, and you'll get details by email on that, everybody. But before we part, can we show our appreciation for Joe's presentation in something approximating to the traditional way, namely by either using the Zoom function or by using your screen to show your appreciation. Yeah. So thank you, Joe, and I hope our paths cross again next time in a more familiar, normal in-person setting rather than
this virtual sense. Yeah,
rather than
definitely. No, but really, thank you again for the invitation. I've really enjoyed it tonight. It's been really good. Thank you. Thank you very much. Take care. And and anyone, if you have any further questions, I've put my email in the chat. And as long as you don't sell Palgrave Macmillan, I can send